The woman stood on the auction block with her hands bound, tears carving tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Magnolia Belle had been sold by her husband's family for the sin of being barren. The auctioneer's voice cut through the desert air. Like a blade, 5-year contract on this fine specimen. Strong back, good teeth, knows her way around a kitchen. The crowd pressed closer. Men with calloused hands and hungry eyes. Women who whispered behind gloved fingers about the shame of a childless wife. Magnolia kept her chin raised, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Cordelia Ashford sat in her black carriage, watching with satisfaction. The old woman's lips curved in something that might have been a smile. She had orchestrated this moment with the precision of a funeral director. Her son Thomas was 3 months dead, and his widow had outlived her usefulness. Territorial law is clear, Cordelia had announced when the papers were signed. Family debts must be paid. Since you gave us no heirs, you'll pay another way. Now Magnolia was livestock, property to be traded for coin. The bidding started at $50. A rancher in a torn hat called out $75. A mining foreman spat tobacco juice and raised it to $100. Each number felt like a nail in her coffin. Then Silas Blackwood stepped forward. The crowd quieted. Blackwood's reputation preceded him like the stench of death. His workers rarely lasted their full contracts. Some said they disappeared into the desert. Others claimed they were worked until their bodies gave out. 150, Blackwood called out. His voice was smooth as snake oil. Magnolia's knees nearly buckled. She had seen Blackwood's camps, seen the hollow-eyed men who stumbled to town for supplies. None of them looked like they expected to see another winter. Going once, the auctioneer announced. The desert wind picked up, stirring the dust around her feet. Magnolia closed her eyes and thought of Thomas. Her husband had been a good man. Despite his family's poison, he would have fought this if he could. Going twice. A quiet voice cut through the silence. $200. Magnolia opened her eyes. A man stepped out of the crowd. Tall, weathered, with kind eyes that seemed out of place in this cruel theater. His clothes were clean but worn. Working man's hands. A father's worried expression. Blackwood's face darkened. $225. The stranger hesitated. Magnolia could see him calculating, weighing the cost against whatever had brought him here. His jaw tightened with resolve. $250. $300. Blackwood snapped. The stranger reached into his coat, pulled out a small leather pouch, counted the contents twice. The crowd watched with the fascination of vultures. $350. That's all I have. Blackwood smiled like a wolf. $400. Silence stretched between them. The stranger's shoulders sagged. Magnolia felt her hope crumble like desert stone. Then the man looked at her, really looked. She saw something shift in his expression, recognition maybe, or simple human decency in a world that had forgotten the meaning of both. "I've got a deed to 40 acres of grazing land," he said. "Worth at least another 100. The auctioneer looked to Blackwood. The land baron's face had gone red with fury. "You'd bankrupt yourself for a stranger?" "Every person deserves kindness," the man replied. "Especially when the world's forgotten." How to show it? Blackwood studied him for a long moment. Something passed between them. Some understanding that this wasn't just about a labor contract. This was about the kind of men they were. "Keep your barren goods," Blackwood finally spat. "You'll regret this charity." The auctioneer brought his gavel down. "Sold to Jasper Thornfield." Magnolia's legs gave out. The stranger, Jasper, caught her before she hit the platform. His hands were gentle but strong, calloused from honest work, not cruelty. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe." Safe. The word felt foreign on her tongue. She hadn't been safe since Thomas died. Maybe not even before that. Jasper helped her down from the platform. Cordelia Ashford watched from her carriage, her face twisted with disappointment. She had wanted Magnolia to suffer. Had wanted her to disappear into Blackwood's camps and never be seen again. "Why?" Magnolia whispered as Jasper untied her hands. He was quiet for a moment, rubbing the rope marks on her wrists with surprising tenderness. "Got 2 daughters at home. Lost there. Mother 2 years back. They need—" He paused, searching for words. "They need someone who understands what it means to hurt." The honesty of it cut through her defenses. This wasn't about charity or pity. This was about survival. About broken people finding each other in the wreckage. "I can't give you children," she said. The words tasted like ash. Children aren't the only way to build a family. He led her to a wagon, old but sturdy. Like everything else about this man, it spoke of quiet reliability. No flash or show, just dependable strength. As they drove away from town, Magnolia looked back once. Blackwood was talking to Cordelia Ashford beside her carriage, their heads bent together in conspiracy. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't finished. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions. Red rock and stubborn brush, a landscape that promised nothing but demanded everything. It matched the emptiness in her chest. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Jasper kept his eyes on the road. "Same thing anyone wants. A chance to make something good out of something broken." The wagon rolled on through the heat, carrying them toward whatever waited at the end of this dusty road. Toward 2 motherless girls and a life that might, against all odds, offer something she had never dared hope for. Redemption. The Thornfield Ranch sat in a valley between red hills, worn down by wind and hope deferred. The house needed paint. The barn leaned slightly eastward, surrendering to gravity one season at a time. But the land held promise beneath its sun-baked surface. 2 girls waited on the porch. The older one by minutes had hair the color of wheat and eyes that missed nothing. She bounced on her toes, curiosity winning over caution. Her sister stood behind her, dark braids hanging like curtains around a face that had learned too early to expect disappointment. "Rosie Ruby," Jasper called as he helped Magnolia down from the wagon. "Come meet Miss Magnolia." Rosie bounded forward with the fearless energy of 8 years old. She studied Magnolia with the intensity of a scientist examining a new specimen. "Are you pretty?" she asked. "Rosie," Jasper warned. "Mama was pretty, before she got sick." Ruby stepped closer to her father. Her small hand found his sleeve and gripped it tight. A lifeline in uncertain waters. Magnolia knelt to meet their eyes. The dust from the road still clung to her dress, but her voice was steady. "I think pretty is what you do, not what you look like." Rosie considered this with the seriousness of a judge. "What do you do?" "I cook. I mend things that are broken. I tell stories when the nights get too quiet." "We like stories," Rosie said. Ruby said nothing. Her eyes held the weight of a child who had learned that loving someone meant losing them. She studied Magnolia with the wariness of a wild animal, deciding whether to trust an outstretched hand. Jasper lifted their few belongings from the wagon. Everything Magnolia owned in the world fit in a single carpet bag. The Ashfords had kept the rest, claiming it as payment for imaginary debts. "Ruby will show you to your room," Jasper said. "It's not much, but it's clean." Ruby shook her head, pressed closer to her father's leg. "I'll find it," Magnolia said. No trouble. The house was small but solid. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that had seen better years, a sitting room where the furniture bore the scars of daily use. Nothing fancy, but everything necessary. A place where people lived instead of just existing. Magnolia's room was barely larger than a closet. A narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out on the barn. It was more space than she'd expected. More kindness than she'd dared hope for. She unpacked her few possessions. A worn Bible, a photograph of Thomas on their wedding day, a small sewing kit. the remnants of a life that had been larger once. Through the thin walls, she heard Jasper talking to his neighbor on the porch. The words came through clear in the desert air. "Those girls need a woman's care, Marcus. I can't do it alone anymore. Could have found yourself a wife instead of buying a stranger. This isn't about me, it's about them." The conversation drifted toward cattle prices and weather predictions. But those first words settled in Magnolia's chest like stones. She was here for the children, a necessity, not a choice. A solution to a problem. She had been useful to the Ashfords until she proved barren. Now she was useful to Jasper until the girls were grown. The reasons changed, but the arrangement remained the same. That first week passed in careful steps around invisible boundaries. Magnolia cooked meals that disappeared from plates without comment. She mended clothes that needed attention. She swept floors and tended the small garden behind the house. Rosie followed her everywhere, chattering about everything and nothing, her mother's favorite songs, the names she'd given to the chickens, the cave in the hills where she and Ruby built fairy houses from twigs and stones. Ruby watched from a distance, always present but never participating. A ghost haunting the edges of every room, the work came naturally to Magnolia. Her hands remembered the rhythm of kneading bread, the patience required for mending tears that went deeper than fabric. But the ranch showed signs of neglect that spoke of larger troubles, fences with gaps that let cattle wander, a roof to place her trust. Rosie looked up from the flowers she was watering. "Can you teach us both, together? If your father approves." "He will," Ruby said with 8-year-old certainty. "He likes you, I can tell." Magnolia's hands stilled on the book in her lap. Children saw things adults learn to hide from themselves, truth spoken without filter or fear. That evening, Jasper found them in the garden as the first stars appeared. 3 heads bent over a slate board, fingers tracing letters that spelled out love in its most enduring form. "Sarah Elizabeth Thornfield," Ruby read aloud. "Beloved wife and mother." "She would be proud," Jasper said quietly. Magnolia looked up to find him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Gratitude, yes, but something deeper. Something that recognized her not as hired help, but as the woman who had given his daughters back their right to remember. The wind stirred the morning glories climbing the garden fence. Blue flowers opening to catch the last light of day, beautiful and fragile, and determined to bloom despite the harsh ground that held their roots. Sometimes the most radical act was simply refusing to let love die when the person who inspired it was gone. Sometimes healing meant making space for both memory and hope to coexist in the same small plot of earth. The letter changed everything. Magnolia found it wedged beneath a loose board in the barn, meant for eyes that would never see it. The paper was expensive, cream-colored stock that spoke of money and influence. The handwriting was educated, precise. She read it twice before the full meaning settled into her bones. The water rights, the railroad deal, the systematic destruction of the Thornfield Ranch, all of it orchestrated by Silas Blackwood with the blessing of Cordelia Ashford. Magnolia's sale hadn't been punishment, it had been strategy. Her hands trembled as she folded the paper. Evidence of conspiracy written in black ink. Proof that her suffering served a larger plan designed to steal land and destroy lives. She found Jasper mending fence in the north pasture. The morning sun cast long shadows across ground that showed fresh signs of sabotage. Another night, another calculated attack. "I need to show you something," she said. He looked up from his work, wire cutter still in his hand. Something in her voice made him set the tools aside without question. She handed him the letter. Watched his face change as he read. Anger flickered first, then understanding, then a cold fury that burned without heat. "How did you find this?" "Hidden in the barn. Dropped by accident, most likely. You can read this." "All of it. Not a question. An acknowledgement of something they had both been dancing around since her arrival. Magnolia nodded once, acceptance. And challenge combined. Where did you learn? My father was a schoolteacher before the war. Said ignorance was the only true poverty. Jasper studied her with new eyes, seeing not just the woman who cooked his meals and taught his daughters, but someone with depths he had never suspected. This changes things, he said, holding up the letter. It explains them. They walked back to the house in silence, both understanding that the game had shifted. No more wondering about bad luck or coincidence. The enemy had a name and a plan. That evening, they spread maps across the kitchen table. Property boundaries drawn in careful lines, water sources marked in blue ink. The geography of greed made visible. If I lose the ranch, Blackwood controls the entire valley, Jasper said. Railroad would have to go through his land. How much is that worth? Enough to buy a senator, maybe two. Magnolia traced the borders with her finger. Such a small piece of earth to inspire such elaborate cruelty. But she understood now why Blackwood had been willing to bid so high at the auction. He hadn't been buying a worker. He had been eliminating a witness. They wanted me gone, she said, in case I knew about Thomas's involvement. Did you? No, but they couldn't be sure. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Thomas Ashford must have discovered the conspiracy before his death. His family's quick move to sell Magnolia wasn't grief or spite. It was damage. Control. Ruby appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Why are you still awake? Just talking, sweetheart, Jasper said, quickly covering the maps. But Ruby had inherited her mother's sharp eyes. She looked from the hidden papers to the tension in both adults' faces. 8 years old, but already learning to read the signs of trouble. Are we in danger? The question hung in the air between truth and comfort. Jasper's instinct was to protect her from worry. Magnolia's was to prepare her for reality. Some people want our land, Magnolia said carefully. We're figuring out how to keep it safe. Ruby nodded with the gravity of a child who had already lost one home to forces beyond her control. That leaked when the rare rains came. Supplies that should have lasted months, but disappeared too quickly. The marks of a man stretched too thin, trying to hold everything together with determination and hope. One evening, she found Jasper staring at papers spread across the kitchen table. Numbers that didn't add up no matter how many times he rearranged them. His shoulders carried the weight of responsibility for 3 lives now, instead of 2. The cattle count came up short again, he said without looking up. Lost another dozen head this week. Wolves? Magnolia asked. Maybe, or rustlers. Hard to tell, but something in his voice suggested he suspected neither. Something else was bleeding his ranch dry, and he couldn't name it. Strange things happened that couldn't be explained by bad luck or natural causes. Fence posts cut clean through, water troughs fouled with salt. Gates left open that had been latched tight. Magnolia said nothing, but her eyes began to catalog the damage. Someone was working against them. Someone who wanted the Thornfield Ranch to fail. The attacks came in Ruby's silence more than words. Small acts of rebellion that spoke louder than shouting. Magnolia's carefully folded laundry scattered across the floor. Salt in the sugar bowl. Dirt tracked deliberately through clean rooms. She doesn't mean it, Rosie whispered one evening as they watched Ruby stomp toward the barn. She just misses Mama. Missing someone doesn't give you the right to hurt others, Magnolia replied, but her voice was gentle. She understood the sharp edges of grief, how it could cut everyone who came too close. That night, she heard crying through the walls. Soft, muffled sobs that spoke of a child's attempt to hide her pain. Magnolia lay in her narrow bed and listened to the sound of a heart breaking in slow motion. She didn't go to comfort Ruby. Some wounds needed to bleed before they could heal. The next morning brought new damage. 3 fence posts cut during the night. The vegetable garden trampled by something larger than rabbits. Fresh hoofprints in the dirt that belonged to no horse on their land. Jasper stood in the ruined garden, his jaw tight with frustration. This is getting beyond coincidence. Magnolia knelt beside the destroyed plants. Someone had been thorough, systematic. This wasn't random vandalism but deliberate sabotage. Who benefits if you fail? She asked. Jasper looked at her sharply. The question had intelligence behind it. The kind of thinking that came from education, not just common sense. Land's worth more than I paid for it, he said slowly. Water rights are valuable. Railroads talking about coming through. Who's talking loudest about the railroad? Silas Blackwood owns most of the county already. But he wouldn't. Jasper paused. Would he? Magnolia didn't answer. But she remembered the look in Blackwood's eyes at the auction. The promise of consequences for the man who had outbid him. Some debts, she was learning, came due in ways that had nothing to do with money. The wind picked up, scattering dust across the broken garden. It carried the scent of rain that might never come, promises that might never be kept. But it also carried something else. The smell of determination. Of people who had decided to fight for what was theirs, even when the odds stood against them. The third week brought the first break in Ruby's wall of hostility. Magnolia found the girl behind the barn, clutching something small and precious. Against her chest, tears carved tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Ruby tried to hide the object, but Magnolia had already seen it. A gold locket, worn smooth by countless worried fingers. The kind of treasure a dying mother presses into her daughter's palm. She's gone, Ruby whispered. The words came out broken, sharp enough to cut. Everyone leaves. Magnolia sat in the dirt beside her. No rush, no forced comfort. Just presence in the space where words failed. Tell me about her, Magnolia said. Ruby's fingers worked the locket's clasp with practiced ease. Inside was a miniature painting of a woman with kind eyes and Ruby's stubborn chin. The artist had captured something that went deeper than looks. Love made visible. She sang while she cooked. Made up songs about everything. The chickens, the weather, Papa's terrible attempts at fixing things. A smile flickered across Ruby's face, gone almost before it appeared. She taught us to read from her grandmother's Bible. Said words were the most powerful thing in the world if you knew how to use them. Magnolia's breath caught. The girl had just revealed something dangerous without knowing it. In a world where most women couldn't write their own names, literacy was both gift and liability. She sounds like someone worth remembering, Magnolia said carefully. I don't want to forget her voice. Then we'll make sure you don't. That evening, Magnolia approached Jasper with an idea that had been forming since. I'll help. You help by being brave, Jasper said. And by staying close to the house. But bravery, Magnolia was learning, came in many forms. Sometimes it was an 8-year-old girl deciding to trust a stranger. Sometimes it was a man risking everything to save someone he barely knew. And sometimes it was a woman choosing to fight back against people who thought she was too broken to be dangerous. The next attack came 3 nights later. Fire this time, licking at the barn's dry timbers with hungry orange tongues. Jasper and Magnolia formed a bucket chain from the well, working in desperate silence while smoke stunned their eyes. They saved the building, but the message was clear. The stakes were escalating. Next time might bring more than property damage. This has to stop, Jasper said as they stood in the smoking ruins of his hay stores. It will, when we make it stop. Something passed between them in the charred darkness, understanding, partnership, the kind of alliance forged between people who had nothing left to lose except each other. They began setting their own traps. Magnolia's education proved useful in ways her father had never imagined. She could forge documents, decode messages, Think 3 moves ahead of men who assumed she was illiterate. More letters appeared, carelessly, dropped by saboteurs who thought themselves safe. Names, dates, payment schedules. The entire conspiracy laid bare by the arrogance of men who believed themselves untouchable. Jasper watched her work with growing admiration and something deeper. Here was a mind that matched his own. A partner in every sense that mattered. "When this is over," he said one evening as she transcribed another intercepted message. "When? What's over? All of it. The threats, the legal complications. When you're free to choose your own path." Magnolia's pen stilled on the paper. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart skip against her ribs. "What are you asking? Nothing you're not ready to answer." But they both knew the question had been posed. Felt the weight of it settling between them like morning dew on summer grass. Inevitable and precious and fragile as first light. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted the moment. Multiple riders approaching fast, their purpose unclear but their urgency unmistakable. Jasper moved to the window, his hand instinctively finding the rifle that hung above the door. Magnolia gathered the scattered papers, evidence too valuable to lose. "Territorial Marshal," Jasper said, reading the badge. That caught moonlight. And Blackwood. The conspiracy was moving into its final phase. No more shadows and sabotage. Time for legal weapons wielded by corrupt men who wore the appearance of law while serving the interests of greed. Magnolia folded the letters into her dress, pressing them against her heart where they wouldn't be found without a search that violated even territorial law's loose standards of decency. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "the truth survives." Jasper nodded once. They had found each other in the wreckage of their separate disasters. Built something precious from the scattered pieces of broken lives. Now they would discover if love was strong enough to survive the storm that was breaking over their heads with the force of desert lightning and twice the danger. The riders dismounted in a jangle of spurs and self-importance. Time to face whatever came next with the quiet dignity of people who had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was standing together when the whole world seemed determined to tear you apart. Marshal Curtis stepped onto the porch with the authority of a man who had never questioned his right to enter any space he chose. Behind him, Blackwood smiled, with the satisfaction of a wolf who had finally cornered his prey. Cordelia Ashford emerged from the shadows, her black dress making her look like grief personified. Her eyes found Magnolia and held them with venomous triumph. "Marshal," Jasper said, his voice steady despite the circumstances, "what brings you out so late?" "Legal matter," Curtis replied, unfolding papers from his coat. "Seems there's been a violation of contract terms." Magnolia felt the letters pressed against her ribs, evidence of conspiracy hidden beneath layers of calico and determination. The truth would survive, even if she didn't. "Miss Bell has been performing work outside the scope of her labor agreement," Blackwood said, his tone suggesting reasonable concern. "Reading, writing, tasks specifically forbidden to indentured servants." "That's absurd," Jasper began. "Is it?" Cordelia stepped forward, her cane tapping against the wooden boards. "Show us your hands, girl." Magnolia extended her hands, knowing what they would reveal. Ink stains on her fingers. The permanent marks of someone who worked with words instead of just washing and cooking. "Educated labor requires different compensation," Curtis said. The conversation behind the barn. He was repairing harness leather by lamplight, his hands steady despite the fatigue that lined his face. "Ruby's mother taught the girls to read," she said. Jasper's needle stopped mid-stitch. "How did you know?" "That? Ruby told me. She's afraid of forgetting." Sarah was educated. Came from back east before her family lost everything in the war. She insisted the girls learn, even though most folks think it's unnecessary for women. Magnolia chose her next words carefully. "I could continue their lessons, if you think it proper." Jasper studied her face in the yellow lamplight. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or the dawning understanding that there was more to his hired help than he'd assumed. "You read," he said. "Not a question." "Some." "More than some, I'd wager." Magnolia met his gaze without flinching. "Education isn't a crime." "No, but it's not common either. Especially for women in your circumstances." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Women in her circumstances weren't supposed to have circumstances at all. They were supposed to be invisible, interchangeable, disposable. The next morning, Magnolia suggested they create a memory garden for Sarah Thornfield. A place where the girls could go to feel close to their mother without forgetting she was gone. Ruby's resistance crumbled completely. She threw herself into the project with the fierce devotion of a child who had found a way to make sense of loss. They chose a spot near the kitchen window where Sarah would have been able to see it while she worked. Ruby and Rosie gathered stones. From the creek bed, smooth river rocks that caught the light. Magnolia found seeds in town, flowers that would bloom in different seasons to mark the passage of time. What was her favorite color? Magnolia asked as they planned the layout. "Blue," Rosie said. "Like the sky right before sunset. Then we'll plant morning glories. They'll climb the fence and turn blue every dawn." Ruby worked with dirt-stained hands and fierce concentration. Each plant placed with ceremony, each stone positioned with purpose. This wasn't just gardening. This was the construction of a shrine, a place where love could live on after the person who inspired it was gone. Jasper watched from the porch, something soft and wondering in his expression. Here was a woman who honored the past instead of trying to erase it, who understood that healing meant integration, not replacement. The sabotage escalated as the garden bloomed. Water troughs poisoned with salt brine. Barn doors left open to scatter livestock across the valley. Always at night, always when no one could see. But patterns emerged for those who knew how to look. The attacks came in waves, timed to cause maximum disruption during crucial work periods. Someone was watching them, learning their routines, striking when it would hurt most. Magnolia began leaving small signs around the property. Threads tied across gates, dust patterns near water sources, tiny pebble arrangements that would shift if disturbed. The tricks of someone who had learned to pay attention to details others missed. "You think it's deliberate," Jasper said one evening as they surveyed fresh damage to the corral fence. "I know it's deliberate. How can you be sure?" Magnolia pointed to the cut marks in the wood. Clean slices made with sharp tools, not the ragged tears of wind or weather. This took time, planning, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Who would go to such trouble? Someone who benefits from your failure. The words settled between them like stones thrown into still water. Ripples of implication spreading outward, touching everything they thought they knew about their situation. That night, Magnolia heard footsteps on the roof. Soft, deliberate, trying not to wake the house. She lay still and listened to the sound of someone doing work that couldn't be done in daylight. In the morning, they found new damage. Shingles pulled loose, exposing the rafters to weather that would rot the wood come winter. Another problem that would drain resources they didn't have. But this time, the saboteurs had made a mistake. Boot. Prints in the soft earth beneath the eaves. A distinctive pattern worn into the sole. A horseshoe nail embedded in the heel. Magnolia studied the tracks with the attention of a hunter reading sign. Someone would be walking around town with that exact pattern under their feet. Someone who thought they were too clever to be caught. The breakthrough came when Ruby asked for her first reading lesson since Magnolia's arrival. They sat in the memory garden as evening painted the sky the color Sarah Thornfield had loved best. "Mama Magnolia," Ruby said, testing the words carefully. "Will you teach me to write her name?" The title settled into place without ceremony or announcement. Natural as breathing, inevitable as sunrise. Ruby had made her choice about where. Consulting his papers, Mr. Blackwood is willing to pay the adjusted rate and take responsibility for the remainder of her contract. The trap closed with legal precision. They had watched, waited, gathered evidence of Magnolia's literacy. Now, they wielded her education against her, using her greatest strength as the weapon to destroy her freedom. "I won't go," Magnolia said quietly. "You don't have a choice," Blackwood replied. "Territorial law is clear." Ruby appeared in the doorway, her nightgown white as a ghost in the lamplight. She looked from face to face, reading the tension with a child's uncanny ability to sense disaster. "Papa, go back to bed, sweetheart." But Ruby had inherited her mother's stubborn streak. She moved to Magnolia's side, small hand finding the woman's skirt and gripping tight. "She's our Mama Magnolia," Ruby announced. "She stays with us." Cordelia's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "The child doesn't understand property law. She understands love," Magnolia said, her voice carrying a dignity that made the marshal shift uncomfortably. "Something you never learned." "Enough sentiment." Blackwood cut in. "Marshal, enforce the transfer." Curtis hesitated. He was corrupt, but not entirely without conscience. The sight of a child clinging to the woman who had become her mother touched something human in his chest. "The girl comes willingly or not at all," he said finally. "I won't drag her off kicking and screaming." Magnolia knelt beside Ruby, her heart breaking with the force of desert storms. She touched the child's face with trembling fingers, memorizing every freckle, every stubborn curl. "I have to go," she whispered. "No," Ruby said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please." Rosie appeared behind her sister, drawn by the sound of crying. She took in the scene with 8-year-old wisdom and threw her arms around Magnolia's neck. "Don't leave us," she begged. "We'll be good. We'll be better." The words cut deeper than any blade. These children thought they had done something wrong, that love was conditional on perfect behavior. They were learning the lesson Magnolia had learned too young, that caring for someone meant risking loss. "You are perfect," Magnolia said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Both of you. Never forget that." She looked up at Jasper, seeing her own anguish reflected in his eyes. He wanted to fight, to stand between her and the forces arrayed against them. But the law was clear, and violence would only make things worse. "Take care of them," she said. "Magnolia." Her name on his lips carried the weight of everything they had never said aloud. Love acknowledged too late, hope strangled by circumstance. She stood, gently disentangling herself from the girl's desperate embrace. Every step toward the waiting horses felt like walking through quicksand, but she forced herself to move. "I love you all," she said without turning around. The words floated back to them on the night air, a promise and a prayer combined. The ride to Blackwood's compound passed in silence, broken only by hoofbeats and the sound of her own heart pounding. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no comfort, no escape. Blackwood's operation was everything she had feared. Crude barracks for workers who looked more like prisoners, guards with hard eyes and harder hands, the smell of desperation and crushed hope. "You'll work the mining camp books," Blackwood told her as they arrived. "Your education makes you valuable. Your attitude will determine how comfortable you are." The threat was clear. Comply or suffer consequences that would make her labor. Contract seemed like a blessing. The work was backbreaking, despite involving no physical labor. Falsified records, doctored accounts, evidence of theft and fraud that Blackwood expected her to help create. Her literacy, once a source of pride, became a tool for corruption. She complied because resistance would bring punishment to innocent workers. But she also memorized every illegal transaction, every falsified document. The truth would survive, even if she didn't. Meanwhile, the Thornfield ranch withered without her organizing presence. Jasper fell into a despair so deep that simple Tasks became impossible. The girls refused to eat, their small bodies growing thin with grief. Ruby took to standing in the memory garden, staring at the horizon as if she could will Magnolia back through sheer determination. Rosie stopped laughing, her natural joy crushed under the weight of another loss. "She's not coming back," Jasper told them one evening, the words torn from his throat. "We have to accept that." "No," Ruby said with 8-year-old certainty. "She promised she loved us. That means she'll find a way." But days stretched into weeks without word. The ranch continued its slow decline, fences unrepaired, cattle scattered, hope bleeding away like water from a cracked jar. Then Jasper made a discovery that changed everything. While searching through Thomas Ashford's effects, looking for anything that might help their legal situation, he found a hidden compartment in an old trunk. Inside were papers that had been concealed since Thomas's death. A will, properly witnessed and notarized. Property deeds in Magnolia's name. Legal documents that painted a picture entirely different from the one Cordelia Ashford had constructed. Thomas hadn't died in a mining accident. He had been murdered, killed to silence his opposition to the railroad conspiracy. And before his death, he had legally transferred his property rights to his wife. Magnolia wasn't an indentured servant. She was a property owner, a woman of means who had been systematically robbed by her own family. The labor contract was void, had always been void, based on fraudulent claims and the legal manipulation of territorial law. Jasper stared at the documents spread across his kitchen table, understanding finally dawning. The conspiracy went deeper than he had imagined. Thomas Ashford had been a victim, not a conspirator. And Magnolia was the rightful heir to a fortune that would make Blackwood's schemes irrelevant. But first, he had to get her back. He looked at his daughters, saw the hope kindling in their eyes as they sensed the change in his demeanor. Ruby and Rosie pressed close, reading over his shoulder despite their limited literacy. "What does it mean, Papa?" Rosie asked. "It means we're going to bring Mama Magnolia home," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Ruby's smile was fierce as sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "I knew she'd find a way." The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows with promise of change. Sometimes the truth lay buried for years before someone with courage enough to dig finally brought it to light. Sometimes justice was just a matter of knowing where to look and refusing to stop until you found what had been hidden. The town rallied around the Thornfield cause with surprising speed. Word of the conspiracy spread through the valley like wildfire, igniting outrage in decent people who had watched too many good families destroyed by powerful men. Jasper rode at the head of a column of neighbors, the legal papers secured in his saddlebag. Behind him came Marcus Webb, old Pete Morrison, the Hendricks brothers, and a dozen other ranchers who had their own grievances against Blackwood's empire. Ruby and Rosie insisted on coming, their small faces set with determination that brooked no argument. They had lost one mother to forces beyond their control. They wouldn't lose another without a fight. "She's in the main compound," Marcus said as they topped the ridge overlooking Blackwood's operation. "Pete saw them bring her in 3 weeks ago." The compound spread below them like a scar on the desert floor. Guard towers, barbed wire, buildings. That looked more like a prison than a workplace. Men moved through the dust with the defeated shuffle of those who had given up hope. Jasper studied the layout with military precision. Multiple exits, clear lines of sight, defensible positions. But they weren't here to wage war. They were here to enforce the law that corrupt officials had perverted. "Remember," he told the gathered men, "we do this legal and proper. No one draws iron unless they're threatened first." The convoy rode down the slope with the authority of righteous purpose. Dust rose behind them like a banner announcing justice. Delayed but not denied. Blackwood emerged from the main building as they approached, flanked by hired guns whose hands rested on their weapons. Marshal Curtis stood beside him, his badge catching the afternoon sun. "You're trespassing on private property," Blackwood called out. "We're here on legal business," Jasper replied, dismounting with deliberate calm. He pulled the papers from his saddlebag and held them up for all to see. Thomas Ashford's will. Properly witnessed and filed. Curtis frowned, recognizing documents that carried weight even in territorial courts bought and paid for. "Let me see those." Jasper handed over the papers, watching the marshal's expression change as he read. The will was ironclad, the property transfers legitimate, the evidence of Magnolia's rightful inheritance undeniable. "Where did you find these?" Curtis asked. "Hidden in Thomas's effects. Concealed by family members who stood to benefit from their suppression." Blackwood's face darkened. "Forgeries. Obvious fabrications designed to circumvent legal contracts." "The notary's seal is genuine," Curtis said slowly. "I know Samuel Morrison's mark. These papers are legitimate." The balance of power shifted with those words. Suddenly, Blackwood was the one on uncertain ground, his schemes unraveling in the desert heat. "Even if they're real," Blackwood tried, "it doesn't invalidate the labor contract. Actually, it does." Jasper's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had studied law by lamplight for weeks. The contract was based on fraudulent claims of family debt. Since Magnolia inherited Thomas's estate, those debts were nullified. "She's been working under false pretenses," Curtis realized. "The contract is void." Blackwood's hand moved toward his gun, but the sound of multiple hammers being cocked stopped him cold. 12 rifles pointed at his chest, held by men who had lost patience with legal corruption. "Easy now," Curtis said, his own weapon remaining holstered. "Nobody needs to get hurt over paperwork. Where is she?" Ruby's voice cut through the tension, high and clear and demanding. She slid down from her horse and walked toward the compound with the fearless determination of a child who knew she was in the right. Blackwood looked at the little girl, then at the armed men behind her, calculating odds that had turned decidedly against him. "Building 3, she's unharmed." Jasper strode through the compound with the twins at his side, his neighbors forming a protective circle around them. Workers stopped their tasks to watch, sensing that something significant was happening. They found Magnolia in a stifling office, bent over ledgers that documented crimes she had been forced to witness. She looked up as the door opened, her face transforming from resignation to wonder to joy in the space of a heartbeat. "Papa." Ruby launched herself across the room, followed immediately by Rosie. Magnolia caught them both, tears streaming down her cheeks as she held them close. Jasper stood in the doorway, drinking in the sight of his family reunited. When Magnolia's eyes met his over the girls' heads, the look that passed between them spoke of love that had endured separation and emerged stronger. "You came," she whispered. "Did you doubt we would?" "Never, but I hoped you'd be careful." "Careful doesn't win wars," Ruby announced, still clinging to Magnolia's neck. "Papa brought the whole county." Outside, Marshal Curtis was placing Blackwood under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and violation of territorial labor laws. The man who had terrorized the valley for years walked away in chains, his empire crumbling behind him. Cordelia Ashford was nowhere to be found. Word came later that she had fled in the night, taking what portable wealth she could carry and leaving her co-conspirators to face justice alone. 6 months later, the Thornfield Ranch bloomed under joint ownership. Magnolia's inheritance had provided the capital to repair years of sabotage and neglect. The water rights Thomas had died protecting now served the entire valley, bringing prosperity to neighbors who had stood by them when it mattered most. The wedding was small but joyful, held in the memory garden where Sarah Thornfield's flowers bloomed in eternal testament to love's endurance. Ruby and Rosie scattered petals while the community that had rescued them witnessed vows spoken with quiet certainty. "Do you, Magnolia Bell Ashford, Take this man as your husband, partner, and equal under territorial law? I do. Do you, Jasper Thornfield, take this woman as your wife, partner, and equal under territorial law? I do. The emphasis on equality was deliberate, a recognition that this marriage represented something different from the traditional arrangements that had failed both of them before. They built a school on the eastern edge of their property, where Magnolia taught reading and writing to children whose parents had never learned such skills. Education was the gift her father had given her, and she passed it on to the next generation with fierce dedication. One evening in late autumn, as the first snow dusted the mountains, Magnolia stood in the memory garden tending flowers that had survived the killing frost. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where new life grew beneath her heart. Ruby found her there as twilight painted the sky the color of Sarah Thornfield's favorite dress. The girl had grown taller, stronger, her face bright with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved. "The garden's growing," Ruby observed, touching one of the winter roses that bloomed despite the cold. "Everything's growing," Magnolia replied, her voice soft with wonder. Jasper emerged from the house, drawn by the sound of voices and the sight of his family gathered where past and future met in perfect harmony. He wrapped his arms around them both, feeling the kick of new life beneath his palm. "What should we name the baby?" Rosie asked, appearing at their side with the sudden materialization that 8-year-olds had perfected. "Something that means hope," Ruby suggested. "Hope is a fine name," Magnolia agreed. "But let's wait and see what feels right when we meet him or her." They stood together as darkness fell, 4 people who had found each other in the wreckage of loss and built something beautiful from the scattered pieces. The desert wind carried the scent of rain that would come with spring, bringing new growth to land that had learned to bloom despite its harsh foundations. Love, Magnolia had discovered, wasn't about perfection or easy answers. It was about choosing to stand together when the world tried to tear you apart. About making space for both memory and hope in the same small plot of earth. The stars emerged one by one, bright points of light in the vast darkness. Each one a promise that tomorrow would come, bringing with it new chances for joy, new reasons to believe that even the most broken hearts could learn to bloom again. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.